Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today we will delve into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where isolation and silence have guarded secrets that defy any rational explanation. Prepare yourself, because what you are about to discover goes beyond any fiction your mind can conjure. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental. In 1894, the mountains of eastern Tennessee were a world apart. Far from the growing cities, far from the railroad tracks that crisscrossed the country, lay deep valleys where entire families lived without seeing a stranger for months. The Appalachian region was known for its rugged terrain, dense forests, and closed communities that distrusted any outsider. At that time, the law had little reach in these highlands, and many stories simply disappeared among the trees and eternal mists. It was in this setting that an isolated property emerged in Sullivan County, hidden among ancient pine trees and steep slopes. The property belonged to a family that few knew by name, but whom everyone avoided mentioning. Travelers crossing the region spoke in whispers about a dilapidated wooden house situated in a clearing where the sun rarely touched the ground. They said that smoke rose from the chimney even on the hottest summer days, and that no one who sought shelter there left in the same condition they had entered. County records from that time show little information about the inhabitants of that property. There were no clear deeds, no full names in the censuses that occasionally reached those mountains. What existed were fragmented accounts from merchants who traveled up the dirt roads to sell tools and fabrics, and who returned disturbed to speak openly about what they had seen. One of these merchants, recorded only as Daniel in the files of a local store, mentioned being greeted by figures who seemed to observe him with an intensity that went beyond ordinary curiosity. The property was located more than 40 kilometers from the nearest town, in a region where the roads were merely poorly defined trails between rocks and roots. Getting there required days of walking or a difficult journey on horseback, crossing icy streams and gorges where one wrong step meant a fatal fall. This hostile geography created a natural shield around the family, transforming the place into its own kingdom, where the rules of the civilized world simply did not apply. The first suspicions arose when traders began to notice a strange pattern. Some travelers who said they were going in that direction were never seen again. Their mules would appear loose days later, wandering the trails without cargo or owner. Travel bags were found abandoned near streams with clothes and belongings scattered as if someone had run away in despair. But there were never any bodies, never any explanations. The forest simply swallowed those people, and the silence of the mountains was the only answer. That we know today that isolation can transform human beings into something different. When there are no witnesses, when there are no consequences, when the only law is that imposed by force, even the limits of morality become blurred. And on that property lost among the Appalachian peaks, something dark had taken root, something that grew in the shadows and fed on the fear of those who dared to get too close. The inhabitants of the nearby villages avoided speaking directly about the mountain family, but their stories circulated in taverns and churches. They said that at night, when the wind blew from the north, it was possible to hear strange sounds coming from that direction. They weren't sounds of wild animals or storms, but something more disturbing, something that made even the most experienced hunters change course and quicken their pace. Some swore they had seen lights moving among the trees at impossible hours, as if someone was searching for something in the absolute darkness of the forest. The summer of 1895 brought a relentless drought to the Tennessee mountains. The streams that normally flowed abundantly turned into trickles of muddy water, and dust covered the trails like a suffocating blanket. It was during this time that an itinerant pastor named Gabriel decided to go up to that isolated region, carrying only his Bible and the conviction that every soul deserved to be reached by the divine word. Gabriel was known in the valley villages for his unwavering determination. He had spent years traveling to the most remote Appalachian communities, bringing sermons and spiritual comfort to families who rarely saw a churchman. He believed that no place was too far, no soul too lost to be saved. When he heard the stories about the mountain family, he saw it not as a reason to avoid the place, but as an opportunity to fulfill his mission. Records from the small congregation Gabriel attended mentioned his departure one morning in August. He noted in his diary that he intended to reach the secluded property before nightfall, spend the night preaching, and return in 2 days. His last recorded words were simple and full of faith. He never returned. When weeks passed without news of the pastor, some members of the congregation organized a search. They climbed the steep trails, crossed the rocky passages, but found only his hat caught on a branch near a dry stream. His Bible was open to a specific page, the pages stained by the dampness of the morning mist. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints other than his own. It was as if Gabriel had simply dissolved into the thin mountain air. The family property remained there, smoldering and silent, but no one dared approach to ask questions. Fear had taken hold permanently among the locals. Something was profoundly wrong in that place, something that went beyond superstitions or exaggerated stories of frightened travelers. The evidence was subtle but consistent. People would enter that direction and simply cease to exist. We need to understand the context of that time to comprehend how this was possible for so long. In 1895, there were no telephones in that remote region, no telegraphs connecting the mountains to the cities. Communication depended on messengers on horseback who took days to cover distances that we now cover in hours. The county sheriff had jurisdiction over immense territories, often impossible to patrol adequately. If someone disappeared in the mountains, it was simply assumed that the wilderness had taken its toll. But there were those who suspected something more sinister. A hardware merchant named Vincent, who kept meticulous records of his trade routes, noticed a disturbing pattern in his accounting books. Over 3 years, at least 7 people who had mentioned plans to visit that specific area of the Appalachians never showed up to finalize pending deals. They were experienced hunters, veteran traders, people accustomed to the dangers of the region. The likelihood that they had all succumbed to natural accidents seemed increasingly improbable. Vincent shared his concerns with the local sheriff, but the response was discouraging. With no bodies, no witnesses, no concrete evidence, there was no legal basis for a formal investigation. Furthermore, entering that property without a warrant would be a serious violation of property rights, and no one wanted to risk a confrontation with people who clearly wished to remain isolated. The law had its limits in the mountains, and everyone knew it. The family rarely went down to the villages. When they did, it was always briefly and discreetly. They appeared at the local store a few times a year, always at dusk, always in silence. They bought salt, gunpowder, coarse fabrics, and tools for heavy work. They paid in old coins whose origin no one knew. Their faces were marked by the relentless sun and hard work. But it was their gaze that most disturbed those who served them, an empty, distant look, as if they were looking through people and not at them. The store owner, listed in the records as Maxwell, once mentioned to an acquaintance that he had tried to strike up a casual conversation with one of the family members. He asked about the harvest, the approaching winter, simple matters of daily rural life. The answers were monosyllabic, almost hostile. Asterisk when Maxwell innocently mentioned having heard about some travelers who had passed through that region. The atmosphere changed instantly. The family member stopped what he was doing, fixed his gaze on Maxwell with icy intensity, and simply left the store without taking half of what he had set aside to buy. Asterisk this type of reaction only fueled suspicions, but also reinforced fear. No one wanted to be the next to provoke that family. No one wanted to find out what really happened in that clearing lost among the ancient pine trees. Silence became a form of protection, an unspoken pact among the inhabitants of the region. Not talking about the mountain family meant not attracting their attention. The seasons changed, and the property remained a shadowy stain on the mental map of Appalachia. The winter of 1896 was particularly harsh, with blizzards isolating entire communities for weeks. When spring finally arrived and the trails became passable again, new reports began to emerge. Hunters spoke of finding hastily abandoned camps near the property with still warm campfires and supplies left behind. It was as if people had fled something in the middle of the night without time to collect their belongings. The arrival of autumn in 1897 marked a subtle but noticeable change in the mountain atmosphere. The leaves acquired shades of deep red and burnt gold, and the morning mist began to linger later, covering the valleys with a thick, silent blanket. It was at this time that a group of government surveyors arrived in the region, tasked with mapping land for potential railroad expansions that could connect those remote areas to the rest of the country. The surveyors were practical men accustomed to dealing with difficult terrain and wary communities. They had worked on dozens of similar projects throughout the Appalachians and were not easily intimidated by stories of isolated mountain dwellers. When locals tried to warn them about certain areas they should avoid, they simply laughed and got on with their work. They had a schedule to meet and reports to deliver. The team leader, a man named Harrison, who had served in military engineering, kept detailed records of each mapped section. His field notebooks show meticulous notes on elevations, watercourses, soil types, and forest density. But there is one entry in particular, dated October of that year, that stands out from the rest. Harrison's normally steady handwriting seemed shaky, the words chosen with unusual care. He describes spotting the isolated property while surveying a high ridge. From his vantage point, he could see the clearing below, the dark wooden house, and several outbuildings that seemed too old to still be in use. What caught his attention, however, was the behavior of the people he managed to observe in the distance. They moved strangely, always looking around as if expecting to be watched, always in patterns that made no sense for normal agricultural activities. Harrison noted that they intended to, if they sent to the property the following day, to take official measurements and notify the occupants about the mapping project, as required by standard procedure. This was his last entry in the field notebook. The surveying team never completed their work in that section of the mountains. 3 weeks later, their equipment was found abandoned on a trail several kilometers from the property, but the men had vanished without a trace. The incident finally forced the authorities to take some action. A larger group was organized, including the county sheriff and several volunteer deputies. They went up to the property on a cold November morning, armed and determined to get answers. What they found there was both disappointing and deeply disturbing. The house was empty, not completely abandoned, but devoid of human presence. There were signs that the people had left in a hurry, leaving dirty dishes on a rough table, clothes hanging on makeshift hooks, tools scattered across the dirt floor. It was as if the occupants had simply evaporated in the middle of their daily tasks, carried away by some urgent call that left no time for tidying up. The sheriff documented everything with the help of a clerk who accompanied the group. They found some strange things, personal objects that clearly didn't belong to a single family. There were pocket watches of different styles, hats of various origins, even a collection of eyeglasses that no one in the family apparently used. They were small things, insignificant in isolation, but together they told a disturbing story about possessions accumulated over time. In the adjacent structures, there was agricultural equipment in a terrible state of disrepair, piles of firewood chopped with axes that seemed too old, and hand tools that suggested a life of constant and isolated labor, but nothing that could be used as concrete evidence of any crime. No sign of violence, no clear indication of the fate of the surveyors or anyone else. The group spent hours examining every corner of the property, searching for something that would explain the mysteries that had accumulated over the years. They checked the barn, the makeshift workshop, even the small storage room where they kept provisions. In each place the same feeling of something wrong hung in the air, but nothing tangible enough to justify formal accusations. One of the deputies, a younger man named Colin, who had insisted on participating in the search, found something peculiar buried shallowly near the property line. It was a rusty metal box locked with a primitive padlock that yielded easily under the force of a lever. Inside were documents deteriorated by dampness, letters written in hurried handwriting, fragments of old newspapers that mentioned people who had set off west and never reached their destinations. The letters were especially disturbing. There were hasty farewells, promises of return that were never fulfilled, plans for the future that remained suspended in time. Some were stained with dirt, others torn at the edges as if they had been ripped from something larger. There was no way to prove where those documents had been obtained, but their presence in that place raised the questions that were impossible to ignore. The sheriff confiscated the box and its contents, promising to investigate the provenance of each item, but even he knew that, without the property's occupants to question, without witnesses willing to speak openly, the case would remain in a frustrating legal limbo. The laws of the time required more than suspicions and disturbing coincidences to prosecute someone for serious crimes. As the group prepared to leave at dusk, the surrounding forest seemed to watch them in silence. No birds sang, no animals stirred among the trees. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that made even the bravest men wish to be far away as quickly as possible. They descended the mountain with the feeling that they had touched something that should have remained hidden, something that was now aware of their intrusion. The months following the discovery of the abandoned property brought a persistent unease to the entire region. The winter of 1897 arrived with unusual force, dumping snow on the mountains and isolating communities that were already naturally distant from one another. During those frigid months, when people gathered around fireplaces and wood-burning stoves, conversations inevitably returned to the mystery of the family that had disappeared as abruptly as the travelers who once vanished in that direction. The sheriff had sent the documents found in the metal box for analysis in larger cities, hoping someone might identify the handwriting or recognize the names mentioned in the fragmented letters. Responses arrived slowly, carried by messengers battling icy roads and storms that lasted for days. Some of the names matched records of people who had been reported missing in previous years, but the connections were too tenuous to build a solid case. A Knoxville city attorney interested in the unusual legal aspect of the case wrote a letter to the sheriff explaining the difficulties they would face even if they managed to locate the occupants of the property without eyewitnesses to any crime, without direct physical evidence of violence, without bodies that could be examined by medical examiners. Any accusation would be based purely on suspicious circumstances, and suspicious circumstances, however disturbing, were not sufficient for convictions in the judicial system of the time. The local community, however, didn't need legal proof to form its own conclusions. The stories about the Mountain family evolved and expanded during that winter, gaining new details with each retelling. Some swore they had seen lights moving across the property even after the official search, as if the former occupants had returned stealthily during the night. Others spoke of strange sounds carried by the icy wind, echoes that didn't seem to come from any ordinary animal or human source. A young hunter named Devon, known for his honesty and sobriety, recounted a disturbing experience during a hunting expedition in early 1898. He had set up camp a considerable distance from the abandoned property in an area he considered safe and familiar. During the night, he awoke with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The full moon illuminated the surrounding snow, creating a ghostly illuminating scene that allowed him to see impressive distances. Devon swore he saw figures in the tree line, standing completely still for long minutes before moving with a silent coordination that defied explanation. He remained in his tent, clutching his rifle with trembling hands until the sun rose and the figures had vanished. When he examined the area in the morning, he found footprints in the snow that approached his camp, circled around it, and then continued back toward the abandoned property. He immediately broke camp and descended the mountain without looking back. Devon's account could have been dismissed as imagination heightened by solitude and darkness, but he was not the only one to report similar experiences during that period. Over the following months, several hunters and travelers mentioned strange encounters in the vicinity of that specific area of the Appalachians. There was a consistent pattern: the feeling of being watched, figures glimpsed in the distance that disappeared when someone tried to approach, footprints that appeared and disappeared without apparent origin or destination. The property itself had acquired a sinister reputation that kept people away even during the day. The sheriff had posted a notice on the front door stating that the place was under official investigation and unauthorized entry would be considered a violation. But nobody needed that notice to avoid the place. The uneasy feeling emanating from that clearing was enough to deter even the most curious. In the spring of 1898, a journalist from a regional newspaper decided to investigate the stories circulating about the mysterious family. His name was Preston, and he had built a solid reputation covering unusual cases and unexplained phenomena throughout the mountains. Preston saw in the story of the isolated property an opportunity to produce a series of articles that could attract significant attention, and perhaps even reveal truths hidden beneath layers of superstition and fear. Preston spent weeks interviewing local residents, collecting every scrap of information he could find. He spoke with merchants who had served members of the family, with hunters who had ventured near the property, with officers who had participated in the initial search. His notes formed a complex picture of a family that had chosen to live in radical isolation, but whose isolation seemed to have a darker purpose than a simple preference for solitude. The journalist discovered something interesting in the county's old records. The property had been established decades before 1894, possibly as early as the 1860s, shortly after the end of the war between the states. The property records were confusing and contradictory, suggesting that the land had changed hands several times in ways that did not follow normal legal procedures. It was as if each new occupation of the property had been done in the shadows, without proper official documentation. Preston also found mention of an earlier incident occurring around 1873 when a group of workers hired to build a bridge over a nearby river had collectively disappeared. At the time, it was assumed that the men had simply abandoned the work in search of better opportunities, something common in that era of constant territorial expansion. But the geographical proximity to the isolated property raised questions that no one had considered at the time. The more Preston investigated, the more he realized that the family's story was not an isolated case of eccentric behavior, but possibly part of a pattern that stretched back decades. There were gaps in local records, periods where people simply ceased to be mentioned in censuses or official documents without clear explanation. Most were travelers, temporary workers, people without strong family ties in the region, individuals whose absence could easily go unnoticed in a world where communication was slow and population movement was constant. The journalist decided to visit the property personally for his final report. He set off on a clear May morning, carrying his notebook, primitive camera, and a determination to document the place that had become synonymous with mystery in the Tennessee mountains. He promised his editors that he would return in 3 days with enough material for a full series of articles that would finally shed light on the obscure events of that region. Preston never returned. His absence was noticed immediately due to his well-known position in the community and the professional commitments he had scheduled. A new search was organized, this time with even more men and resources. They found his camera destroyed near a stream, the photographic plates broken and exposed to light, making it impossible to reveal any image he might have captured. His notebook was partially burned with only a few legible pages, containing vague descriptions of the oppressive, that atmosphere of the place. The incident involving Preston marked a turning point in the authorities' stance. The disappearance of a well-known journalist, someone with connections in larger cities and whose absence could not be easily ignored, brought political pressure that the case had not previously experienced. The state governor was notified and discussions, which began about the need to establish a stronger law enforcement presence in those mountainous regions where isolation created effectively zones. But even with renewed official attention, the concrete mysteries remained unsolved. The property was still empty when checked, but signs of intermittent occupation persisted. Fresh ashes in the fireplace, recent boot prints on the dirt floor, doors that had been opened and closed since the last inspection. It was as if a game of hide-and-seek was being played with phantom occupants who knew exactly when to avoid detection. The summer of 1899 brought an unexpected change to the Appalachian Mountains. The federal government had decided to establish a ranger station in the region, part of a larger effort to monitor and protect the vast wilderness areas covering eastern Tennessee. The choice of location was not accidental. State authorities had been pushing for a permanent official presence in that specific area, hoping that constant surveillance might finally bring answers to the unexplained events that had plagued the region for years. The forest ranger assigned to the post was a man named Lawrence, a veteran of military campaigns in the west of the country and accustomed to dealing with hostile territories and distrustful populations. Lawrence was not superstitious by nature and saw the stories about the mysterious family as exaggerations born of isolation and lack of formal education. He arrived in the region determined to establish order and rationality in a place that seemed to have been dominated by irrational fear. Forestry Station was built on a strategic elevation that allowed for a wide view of the surrounding valleys, including a partial view of the property that so concerned the local residents. Lawrence established a disciplined routine of patrols, mapping, and interaction with the communities scattered throughout the mountains. His goal was to become a known and trusted presence, someone people would turn to when they needed help or had information to share. In the first few months, Lawrence meticulously documented everything he observed. His reports sent to his superiors were models of precision detailing weather conditions, wildlife movement, signs of human activity, and the general state of the trails and paths. He mentioned the isolated property in some reports, noting that it appeared to be genuinely abandoned with vegetation beginning to reclaim the clearing and structures, showing clear signs of deterioration. But as autumn approached, something in Lawrence's notes began to change. His descriptions became less technical, more contemplative. He mentioned feeling watched during certain patrols, a sensation he initially attributed to the presence of wild animals in the vicinity. However, his survival instincts, honed by years in dangerous territories, told him that this observation had a different quality, more intentional and calculated. In October of that year, Lawrence had his first direct encounter with something inexplicable. During a night patrol, he lit a campfire on high ground to brew coffee and rest before returning to the station. As he watched the flames, he noticed movement in the tree line in the distance. Human figures or something that moved like humans moving among the shadows with a silent coordination that seemed almost choreographed. Lawrence called out to the figures, identifying himself as a forest ranger and offering to share his campfire if they needed warmth or guidance. There was no verbal response, only a pause and movement, as if the figures were considering his words. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they vanished into the darkness of the forest. When Lawrence examined the area in the morning, he found footprints that confirmed the presence of several people, but the tracks simply ended at a rocky outcrop where it would be impossible to continue following. This incident marked the beginning of a series of similar encounters over the following months. Lawrence began to notice a pattern. The figures always appeared at dusk or in the early hours of the morning, always kept a safe distance, and always disappeared before they could be approached directly. It was a strange dance of proximity and avoidance, as if Lawrence were being studied, evaluated by criteria he couldn't understand. The forest ranger wasn't easily intimidated, but he wasn't a fool either. He began to vary his patrol routes to modify his schedules, trying to establish some form of control over when and where these encounters occurred. But the figures always seemed one step ahead, appearing at times and places that suggested intimate knowledge of his movements and routines. It was as if the entire forest was working against him, providing information to the unseen observers. During the harsh winter of 1899 to 1900, Lawrence remained at his station most of the time, carrying out only essential patrols due to the extreme conditions. The snow covered the mountains so thickly that long journeys became dangerous and impractical. It was during this period of forced isolation that he began to reflect deeply on everything he had witnessed since his arrival in the region. In his personal diaries, which would be discovered years later, Lawrence wrote about the growing feeling that he was dealing with something that defied his normal categories of understanding. He had faced hostile groups in other regions. He had dealt with people who lived outside the boundaries of conventional society, but this was different. There was a quality of organization, of coordinated purpose, that suggested something more complex than simple mountain people avoiding authority. When the spring of 1900 finally arrived, Lawrence made a decision that his superiors would consider reckless. He planned an expedition to the abandoned property, not as an official investigation, but as an attempt to establish direct communication. His reasoning was simple. If there were people living clandestinely in that area, it was better to bring them into some kind of civilized arrangement than to allow them to continue operating completely outside of any social structure. Lawrence set off one morning in April, carrying provisions for several days and a white flag tied to a long pole, a universal symbol of peaceful intentions. He left a detailed itinerary at the station, clear instructions as to when he expected to return, and explicit requests for a search to be organized should he not return within the established time frame. It was a sensible precaution given the circumstances, but also a tacit acknowledgement of the real risks he faced. The first 2 days of the expedition passed without notable incident. Lawrence followed familiar trails, camped in strategic locations, and kept detailed notes of everything he observed. But on the third day, as he approached the property, the atmosphere began to change noticeably. The silence of the forest deepened. The animals seemed to have abandoned that section of the mountains, and even the wind blew less frequently. as if the air itself were hesitating to cross that territory. When Lawrence finally spotted the clearing where the property was located, he was surprised by what he saw. The house, which should have been in an advanced state of disrepair, showed clear signs of recent maintenance. The surrounding vegetation had been controlled, some of the structural planks appeared to have been replaced, and thin smoke rose from the chimney, indicating an active fire inside the building. Someone was definitely living there. Despite all previous official inspections reporting complete abandonment, Lawrence approached slowly, keeping the white flag visible and calling out loudly, announcing his peaceful intentions and his desire only to converse. There was no verbal response, but the door of the house opened slightly, enough for him to know he was being observed from within. He stopped at a respectful distance, placed his weapons on the ground in a show of good faith, and waited. What happened in the following minutes, Lawrence would later describe as one of the most tense moments of his life. The door remained ajar. No sound came from inside the house, and the feeling of being under intense scrutiny was almost physical in its intensity. Then, finally, a figure emerged from the darkness inside, moving slowly, deliberately, remaining in the shadow of the porch to make clear identification difficult. Lawrence remained motionless, controlling his breathing, and keeping his hands visible in a neutral position. The figure on the porch was difficult to discern, clearly due to the shadows cast by the low roof of the house, but it appeared to be a man of medium height, wearing dark, worn clothes that blended into the blackened wood of the structure. The silence between them stretched for long moments, broken only by the distant whisper of the wind in the treetops of the pine trees surrounding the clearing. Finally, Lawrence decided to break the tense impasse. He formally introduced himself, explained his position as the assigned forest ranger for that region, and expressed his desire to simply establish communication with everyone living under his jurisdiction. His words were carefully chosen, avoiding any accusatory or threatening tone, focusing instead on practical aspects of security and mutual cooperation that would benefit both parties. The figure on the balcony did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if not frequently used, carrying a heavy mountain accent that made some words almost incomprehensible. He said they didn't need help from the government. They didn't need outside interference in matters they had managed on their own for decades. There was a warning tone in those words, a boundary being set clearly, but not explicitly hostile. Lawrence tried a different approach. He mentioned past incidents, the disappearances that had worried the community, the suspicions that hung over the property like a permanent cloud. He said that his presence there was not to make accusations, but to help clarify misunderstandings that could have serious consequences if not addressed properly. He offered the possibility of mediation, of serving as a bridge between that isolated family and the authorities who would eventually come with less willingness to dialogue. The mention of the disappearances provoked a noticeable reaction. The figure on the balcony stiffened and other shadows moved behind the house's windows, suggesting that there were more people observing the gathering. There was a long pause before the response, and when it came, it carried a mixture of defensiveness and something Lawrence interpreted as profound wariness, the weight of secrets kept for too long. The man said that travelers came and went through the mountains as they always had, that the forest was vast and dangerous, that accidents frequently happened on treacherous terrain and during sudden storms. He said that his family kept to themselves precisely to avoid problems with strangers, that they had learned long ago that the outside world only brought complications and unfair judgments. Every word was measured, every sentence constructed so as not to reveal too much or sound like an admission of guilt. Lawrence pressed gently, mentioning the objects found on the property during previous searches, personal belongings that had clearly belonged to different people over the years. He asked how those items had gotten there, if there were any innocent explanations that could dispel the suspicions surrounding the family. It was a direct question, but asked without aggression, an opportunity for the truth to be presented in a way that could be understood and perhaps even accepted. The answer was evasive. The man spoke of finding abandoned things on the trails, of travelers who stopped to ask for water or directions, and sometimes left forgotten belongings, of occasional exchanges with passers-by. These were plausible explanations individually, but together they seemed insufficient to account for the quantity and variety of objects that had been documented. Lawrence realized that he would not obtain direct confessions. Not at that moment, perhaps never. He changed tactics again, focusing on practical aspects of the future instead of the hazy past. He spoke of changes coming to the mountains, of railroads that would eventually be built, of development that would bring more people and inevitably more scrutiny. He suggested that it would be in the family's best interest to establish some form of cordial relationship with the authorities, before circumstances forced less amicable confrontations. For a moment, Lawrence thought he had made some progress. The man's posture on the porch seemed to relax slightly, as if he were genuinely considering the forest ranger's words. But then something changed, perhaps an invisible signal from inside the house, perhaps simply the recognition that the conversation had gone too far, revealed too much. The man took a step back toward the door, his body language becoming closed off again. He told Lawrence he should leave, that darkness was approaching, and the trails were dangerous at night, even for someone who knew the area well. It wasn't exactly a threat, but it carried a weight of warning that couldn't be ignored. Lawrence understood that he had reached the limit of what he could achieve that day. He picked up his weapons from the ground, maintaining slow and deliberate movements, and began to retreat towards the tree line. Before leaving the clearing, Lawrence made one last attempt. He said he would leave the door open for future conversations, that his station was always available if they needed help, and that he much preferred working with them than against them. There was no verbal response, but the figure on the porch remained visible until Lawrence disappeared completely into the forest, a silent sentinel ensuring that the visitor was truly leaving. The walk back to the forest station was one of the longest Lawrence had ever experienced. Every shadow among the trees seemed to hold hidden observers. Every sound of breaking branches suggested footsteps following him in the distance. He knew he was being escorted, assured that he was indeed leaving that territory and not attempting deceptive maneuvers. It was a subtle but unmistakable display of power, a reminder that this family knew every inch of those mountains in ways he could never match. When he finally reached the station at nightfall, Lawrence immediately began documenting everything that had happened. His notes from that day are particularly detailed, capturing not only the objective facts of the encounter, but also the subjective impressions, the sensations that words have difficulty conveying adequately.